Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us here at the Enterprise Institute for today's event. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at AEI, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting presentation and a really interesting discussion to follow. Indices are always interesting, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. The name of this event is Identifying Pathways to Prosperity, Insights from a New State-by-State Index, and that index is the U.S. Prosperity Index recently, or I guess released today, by the Legatum Institute in London. That holds a special personal connection for me because I used to be with the Legatum Institute and was a participant in the first 3 global prosperity indices that the Institute produced a number of years ago. And so that global index has set the basis for a new country-level analysis here of the United States, looking at how all 50 states stack up against each other according to a more expanded definition of prosperity than you might be familiar with. And so I'm not going to spoil anything more. I'll let our colleagues from the Legatum Institute explain what they mean by prosperity and how they're measuring it in this index in a little bit. And before I introduce the CEO of the Legatum Institute, Baroness Philippa Stroud, we're going to have a short video, after which I'll introduce her, and her colleagues from the Legatum Institute will walk you through the index itself, and then we'll follow it with a panel discussion. But I think we've got a video queued up now, if I'm not mistaken. Here we go.
The United States economy is world-leading, but prosperity is about much more than wealth. It reaches beyond the financial into the political, the judicial, the well-being and character of a nation. In our Global Prosperity Index, the US ranks just 17th. While best in the world for business environment, it is 23rd for personal freedom and 35th for health. On safety and security, it ranks 43rd, nestled between Qatar and North Macedonia. America's undeniable economic success is not yet translating fully into social well-being, and we wanted to understand why. Our new US Prosperity Index reveals a mixed picture. Overall, prosperity has increased over the past decade, although there is still a significant north-south divide. However, the gap between the most and least prosperous states has narrowed. Employment has recovered in almost all states following the financial crisis, and across the country, health, education, and living conditions have improved. But the data suggests that the institutions through which policy impacts people's lived experience are not effectively converting wealth generation into improved living conditions for all. And across the US, further growth in prosperity is being held back by weakening social networks and the decline of trust in institutions such as the media, as well as the growing mental health crisis. For the first time, our index provides a comprehensive picture of all aspects of prosperity, state by state. It reveals that while some states clearly outperform others, no state has succeeded in fully securing both economic and social well-being. The index allows policymakers across the US to identify areas of local strength and understand where they can learn from the strengths of other states. It is in our gift to create an environment in which every person can reach their full potential and flourish in a truly prosperous society.
Terrific. Well done. Thank you for that. I'm really looking forward to digging into the guts of this index and what we can learn about our own country and our individual states from it. And so to kick us off today, I'd like to introduce to you Baroness Philippa Stroud, who's the CEO of the Legatum Institute. Before she was at Legatum, Baroness Stroud was the executive director of the Center for Social Justice, a UK-based think tank, which she had a hand in founding some years ago and which had a profound impact on policymaking in the UK. Her life and career have been strongly marked by a passion to tackle poverty and social breakdown. And before she was at the Center for Social Justice, she was a special advisor to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and later to the Prime Minister himself. In these roles, she was responsible for working on social welfare reform, universal credit, and creating social investment and new child poverty measures. She was ennobled in 2015. and received the title of Baroness Stroud of Fulham. And so I'd like you to join me in welcoming Philippa to the podium right now. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you so much for that warm welcome. Ryan and I have actually been friends and colleagues for many years, from his time in the White House as well, and then when he came to London and worked at the Legatum Institute, and then now at AEI. So we are delighted to be partnering with AEI to launch our United States Prosperity Index, and you may recognize my voice from the voice in the video, so I do apologize about the English accents this afternoon. And we're also really grateful that Carol Graham has joined us from Brookings, who'll be responding to our presentation later on. As Ryan said, my name is Philippa Stroud, and as well as having the privilege of being a member of the House of Lords, I'm also the CEO of the Legatum Institute. And our mission is to provide the leadership, the clarity and the vision to address the very real challenges the world faces today, challenges that are causing many of us to rethink our political, social and economic systems. And we seek to shape the values, ideas and the policies which will create pathways from poverty to prosperity for individuals, communities and nations. And we firmly believe that what gets measured gets done. And that's why for the last 13 years, we've been tracking how prosperity has evolved around the world through our Global Prosperity Index. And when we talk about prosperity, we mean more than just financial or material wealth, as you'll have picked up in the video. We believe that there are two fundamental components to real prosperity. First, economic well-being, and second, social well-being. And those two are not independent of one another. Rather, true prosperity is a result of them working hand in hand. With over a decade of experience behind us, we have some expertise in providing and analysing data and in understanding the true drivers of prosperity. Normally at the Institute, we would focus on the bottom 90 countries in our Global Prosperity Index because our focus is on creating the pathways from poverty to prosperity. But many of those nations have been asking us for insight into how a nation at the top of the index has created its own prosperity. So it was an ambition for us to create a US index, and we were delighted to be able to partner with the Helmsley Charitable Trust to undertake this work. For more than a century, the United States has been the world's economic powerhouse. I don't need to tell you that. Indeed, your economy is about to mark the longest period of continued growth in history, with 20 million jobs created since the recession. It's a remarkable story. Yet when we look at our Global Prosperity Index, as we saw in the video, the US has remained around 17th in the global index for the last 10 years, and we wanted to understand why. Why is the undeniable economic success of the United States not translating itself fully into social well-being? And what can the scale and variety of the US economy tell us that we can then apply to the growth of prosperity across the globe? As a result, we have produced a uniquely rich and comprehensive index that measures both the economic and the social well-being, the fundamentals of prosperity of each and individual state. And our findings give us cause for optimism, and hopefully will give you cause for optimism too. Overall prosperity is rising, and the gap between the most prosperous and the least prosperous states has narrowed, which is quite a remarkable story and not one that you always hear reported in the media. Employment has recovered in almost all states following the financial crisis, and across the country, health, education, and living conditions have seen improvements. But there's also another story. As J.D. Vance questioned recently, do people look to the future and see a place that's worth having children? Do they have good enough jobs so that they can make the necessary sacrifices so that parents can be available to parent their children? Do they have economic prospects and the expectation that they're going to be able to put a roof over their child's head, put food on the table, and provide that child with a good education? He says, by every statistic that we have, what we see is that some people are answering no to all these questions. We know that a nation is prosperous when it has an open economy, an inclusive society, and empowered people who are healthy, educated, and safe. Through the index, we hope to encourage a vibrant exchange of ideas between and among states right across the country. We want to equip and empower decision makers to shape an agenda for real and lasting transformation that will benefit everyone and lead to families being able to say yes to all of those questions. So that's why we're so proud about the work of this index. We bring it to you in real humility. We're data experts. We so need you to help us with the interpretation and to take it forward. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Bryan, our Director of Policy at the Legatum Institute, who will speak on the important role that institutions can play in translating economic well-being into social well-being. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you, Philippa, and thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be back here again at AI. Good afternoon. So, as Philippa said, we firmly believe that what gets measured gets done. And if we want to drive prosperity, you need a tool that's capable of capturing it and measuring it. And that has been the essence of our indexes. Now, to achieve this throughout the United States, we wanted to create an index that captured the level at each state of the union, what was enhancing prosperity, and how did that work as a measure. And what we've found is that when we looked at the global index, we could see, because we had a very wide range of countries, very big disparities in outcomes. And our analysis at global level was able to give us a sense of what was the underlying driver of both GDP per capita in terms of the wealth generation, but also social well-being. And Carol will talk to us a bit more later on this afternoon about that. But what you see when you look around the world with big disparities, and from an analytical point of view, you can start to see the drivers that you can't see when you look at a more homogenous group of say, states within the United States. So our sense was that we had this structure in the global index, that we wanted to, in effect, find the appropriate analogy within the US. And then, given that holistic view, we could allow, in effect, what are the sort of state laboratories of experimentation to be properly and holistically measured. And when we looked at indexes that were already out there in the, say, the Best States Index, the Freedom of the 50 States, the Social Progress Index of the United States, we found lots of really good but narrow perspectives. So we could see how health and education was doing with the Social Progress Index. We could see how elements of freedom, both economic and personal freedom, were doing with respect to the Freedom of the 50 States. But looking at those indexes on their own, we couldn't put something together that gave what people in the industry sometimes call a balanced scorecard. There was no way of lining everything up and saying, in the round, how are the states doing? And that's really what drove us to say we needed to design this from scratch, using the evidence that we'd got at a global level. And I think, as Ryan mentioned earlier, our definition then is a much broader one and more structured than perhaps a sort of casual throwaway view, what does prosperity mean? So what I'd like to do is take those three domains that Philippa mentioned, the open economies, inclusive societies, and empowered people, and unpack them one at a time and give you a sense of what's behind the index. So, open economies. Here we essentially capture the robustness of the economic engine within a state across a number of discrete pillars. So the first one is the business environment, which looks at the rules and the regulations that determine what it takes in any given state to grow and develop a business, from labor market regulations, access to capital, or the extent of, say, occupational licensing. And that's a good analog would be the World Bank's ease of doing business at a global level. But then we also want to capture the quality of infrastructure and market access. How convenient is it for business to operate? Are there good transport links? The communication system working well? Are there good access to resources? Such as a reliable electricity service, which in this city, indeed New York, in the last week or so, is a very relevant thing to think about. It's a non-trivial issue. Then the final aspect within open economies is the economic quality of each state. And what we mean by that is, in effect, the observable outcomes. Is there a high level of labor force engagement? Are the operations, the business within the state, are they productive and competitive? How sound is the state's fiscal setup? So by looking at that, you get a much better sense of the sort of the soundness, the sustainability of the economy within a state, in addition to thinking about the quality of its policy environment. Then the second domain that we look at, inclusive societies, looks at the institutional structures of a particular state. But here, we're looking at both the formal ways in which there are institutions, but also the informal ways. So we're thinking not just about the state government, but also all the different ways in which people engage and interact with each other. And in effect, what we're trying to do here is capture the manifestation of the local social contract. So if we think at a federal level, there's a template. Every state within the federal structure has a broadly similar set of formal institutions. But the way in which they're manifested on the ground through the informal institutions, the culture, is actually quite different. And we see this, as Philippa has indicated, as very, very important. So how do we measure and unpack that? First, we consider safety and security. Is the state peaceful? In that sense, are there low levels of crime, violent crime, property crime? What's that like? Are people safe in their lives? The next area we look at is around freedoms, civil rights, social tolerance. So what's the degree of agency people have? Are they free to join or not join associations? How much discrimination? Is there both sort of legal discrimination and, again, informal discrimination? And how high a degree of social tolerance is there? Because this sense of the real freedoms and the sense of freedom are really important to the extent to which people can engage and participate in society. Then we also consider the strength of social capital. Are families strong? Are there bonds of trust between neighbors and with strangers? Is there confidence in public bodies such as the media, the government, courts, the police, and the media as well, one which has actually been declining? And here we see an interesting contrast between two neighboring states. So we look at Utah. It has very strong family structures, high degrees of trust, and a good high level of civic engagement, all the sort of things that you need to have strong social capital. Neighboring Nevada is very much the mirror image and has some of the lowest levels of trust in the country. And this, again, affects how wealth can get translated into well-being. Finally, in this domain, we look at governance. So there's a level of integrity and the level of accountability of the state government. And here, when we look at that, we can see and set out the contrast between places such as Washington State at one end and Arkansas at the other. Now, the third domain is empowered people. And this is where we capture the lived experience of people's social well-being, measuring the more direct drivers of life satisfaction, such as living conditions, including poverty rates, health, education, and the natural environment. And as you can imagine, these measurements, when they're brought together, provide a good scorecard detailing why states such as Connecticut have a much better performance than the likes of, say, Alabama or Texas. So what we've been able to do is bring all these dimensions together into one place, one index that combines the lived experience of people, quality of the institutions, how inclusive society is, and then the extent to which the state's economy is open. And in doing so, we believe that we have, as Philippa mentioned, a uniquely holistic view of prosperity, and then a rich and comprehensive understanding of each of the 50 states plus DC. Structured through 11 pillars, 48 discrete elements that are captured policy-relevant ideas, and then all underpinned by around 200 individual indicators. The great thing about having done this structure like this, and having set it up, really learning from our global index, is with a little bit of an approximation, we can then ask ourselves the question, well, if each of the states were a nation, where would they lie in our global index? Where would some of the high-performing states be if they were countries? And for example, if we look at it like that, we'd see that Connecticut has about the same level of prosperity as Germany. Michigan looks a bit like Belgium, and Mississippi has a similar level of prosperity as Portugal. But that's really good news, because this suggests that even the weakest performing state is, in global terms, still a very strong performer. So there's a lot, as Philippa said, to be hopeful here, that in aggregate, while it's 17th, US 17th as a country in the world, the lowest performing state's in around 25. So it's quite a narrow spread in a global context. And then, once we've got this, what we've been able to do start to see some really interesting patterns around the country, especially when we ask ourselves, how does one domain of prosperity perform against another in relation to the other? So for example, when we look at the North-South divide, on what elements is it most prominent? And interestingly, we see it in the institutional pillars. So the biggest North-South divide we see is in terms of government integrity, our levels of discrimination, crime, and trust. Then we ask further, what explain the differences in social well-being between the states? So, for example, why are living conditions better in New Hampshire than in California? Or why is health better in Nebraska than Florida, even before the Medicaid expansion in Nebraska? Or why was education better in Iowa than in Georgia? Now, obviously, income has a lot to do with it, and I think well-known correlations at a macro level between income levels and these indicators of social well-being. But that only explains about 50% of the variation that we see across the states. So while income is an important driver, it's by no means the only one. So what explained the rest? And this is what, and Philippa's telegraphed, this is what became really interesting to us, that the thing that explained most of the rest were the quality of institutions. And we mean this in that sort of broader definition of formal and informal institutions. But that means things like the crime rate, the quality of governance, the degree of social capital, the level of tolerance were actually really important in determining whether the wealth generation engine translated into social well-being. So we're starting to see these are as mediating institutions. The nature of that local social contract is the critical transmission mechanism between the wealth generating engine and people's lived experiences. So we think that's sort of one of, John was asking earlier about some of the most important findings for us. That really, I think, tees up a lot of questions that we need to be asking ourselves. So hence, we see now that prosperity grows and develops when leaders, whether at a state or federal level, make active and focused decisions to build and drive an agenda for positive change, and where there's a lot of focus on vibrant and ethical institutions that can do that translation from economic prosperity into social well-being. And I think what we're also seeing is that now, for the first time, because of this holistic perspective, the true potential of each individual state can be identified and understood. And Sean will give us a few more insights into that in a minute. But it means now, we believe that governors, policymakers, business and community leaders can identify solutions to local problems and see the ones that have been tried and tested in other states, and thereby enabling the implementation of much more targeted and effective policies that will drive tangible improvements. And we can see there's an opportunity for every state. Because other than Massachusetts, every state has at least one of our 11 pillars where it ranks below 20th against all its peers. So in effect, every state has at least one area where there's a real opportunity for improvement. And that probably is the way in which the answer to Philippa's original question, how could America go from being 17th to better in the global index, is at a state level, finding those weak spots and strengthening them. And this is why I think it's a really good phrase that I think is well used in this country, the Justice Brandeis's comment about the states as being laboratories of experimentation. But we believe with indexes like this, with scorecards, we can actually help provide the feedback mechanism so there's a much more genuine and to an extent objective process for test and learn. So in conclusion, this index shows us how many of the dynamics that we've seen playing out at global level are also playing out at a state level. We see economic well-being as critical for social well-being and vice versa. But most critically, and this is the bit that is often overlooked, it's these formal and informal institutions that are so essential that the flywheel that Philippa showed earlier is operating in a good way in every state. So I'd now like to invite Sean Flanagan, head of our Centre for Metrics, to share with you some of the key findings of the index. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. And good afternoon, everybody. It's my first time here at AEI, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here. As Stephen said, I am the Director for the Centre for Metrics, and it has been my responsibility and huge privilege to lead the team that has produced the USPI. The report that you have in front of you, and also the dedicated USPI website that was gone live today. But we haven't been working in isolation. I'm conscious that you may be wondering why, when you're in DC, aside from Ryan, you haven't heard from anybody with an American accent. But I'm delighted to see that many of our US working group members in the audience, of whom there are around 40 in total, They have provided invaluable expert advice in guiding us in setting up the index. We are immensely grateful to them for their advice and commitment. Thank you. In creating the US Index, as Philippa has said, we have drawn upon 13 years of expertise in producing the Global Prosperity Index. The result is that we've been able to create a uniquely vivid and holistic picture of the economic and social well-being of each of the 50 states and DC, and how this has changed over the past decade. What have we found so far? Well, overall, US prosperity has been increasing over the past decade, with all but 4 states seeing an improvement. The increase has principally been driven by improvements in the economic quality pillar. Labour force engagement has spearheaded the growth, with all but 4 states now exceeding pre-financial crisis levels. The increase in prosperity is also partially explained by improvements in health, education, and, more recently, living conditions. Before looking at the individual performance of states, our analysis also shows that there are some challenging nationwide issues that are impacting every state. Firstly, health. The US ranks 35th globally for health, and which is seen as an improvement over the first 8 years of the past decade. But due to a growing mental health crisis, health has actually deteriorated over the past 2 years. The number of drug overdose-related deaths doubled between 2009 and 2017, culminating over 70,000 deaths in 2017, with all but 1 state, Oregon, seeing an increase. Some states, however, are facing a bigger challenge than others. West Virginia, for example, saw their drug overdose death rate increase by 2.5 times over the past decade, to 52 deaths per 100,000 people. Nebraska, on the other hand, has 6 deaths per 100,000 people. Some of you may have seen the data released earlier this week, and while it is encouraging to see drug overdose deaths declining for the first time since 1990, this still resulted in nearly 69,000 deaths last year. Increasing suicide rates across all states and the increasing prevalence of serious mental illness are also contributing to the decline in mental health. Secondly, levels of trust are in decline across the US, with less trust in the media and decreasing interactions with neighbours being the main contributing factors to the decline in social capital, resulting in 40 states having a weaker performance in 2019 than in 2009. In terms of individual states, we find that Massachusetts is the most prosperous and Mississippi is the least, and this has been the same for the past 10 years. However, as Philippa mentioned, the gap in prosperity between Mississippi and Massachusetts has narrowed over the past 10 years. While it is good news that Mississippi is catching up, at the current rate of progress, it would take about 140 years for Mississippi to have the same level of prosperity as Massachusetts. Prosperity is not universally shared. As you will have seen from the map earlier, and this one, there is a strong north-south divide with high prosperity in the northeast and the weak performance of states in the southwest and southeast. 9 of the 10 weakest performing states are in the south. The pattern is seen most strongly in inclusive societies and empowered people. Whilst there is a broad north-south divide, as can be seen from the list of the top 10 states, and as Stephen has mentioned, no single state has yet succeeded in securing both economic and social well-being for all its residents. Each state has the potential to increase prosperity, and there are clear opportunities for each state to learn from each other. So, for example, consider the District of Columbia, which granted is more akin to a city-state and is also different to the 50 states given its unique governance structure. But it would feel inappropriate not to mention it given where we are. As a result of high volumes of venture capital deals, the highest assets under management per capita, the highest bank density, and also the lowest levels of regulation being imposed on businesses, DC is the top performer on the business environment pillar. Vermont, on the other hand, has seen declining venture capital activity over the past 10 years. What might Vermont learn from DC to improve its venture capital investment? Also in the Northeast, Rhode Island has seen a decline in dynamism due to the survival rates of startups falling and a declining rate of new entrepreneurs entering the market. Washington State, on the other hand, has seen an improvement in these two indicators, which has led to it moving up 15 places in the economic quality pillar since 2009. What has Washington done to create a supportive environment for new businesses that Rhode Island or other states could learn from? Despite the decline in dynamism, Rhode Island has seen its overall prosperity improve, rising up 2 ranks since 2009, due to an improvement in social capital. People from the state are increasingly likely to trust others in their neighbourhood, with 68% of residents trusting other neighbours compared to 61% a decade ago. Furthermore, while the proportion of people doing favours for their neighbours has fallen by over 6 percentage points across the region, Rhode Island has seen a small increase. Rhode Island is bucking the national decline in social capital. What can other states learn from neighbourhood communities in Rhode Island to help reverse the national decline? Texas, as you will well know, is an economic powerhouse. But it is an example of economic success not fully translating into the well-being of its residents. Texas contains 26 of the largest 200 cities in the US, and it has the second largest economy in the States after California. This network of cities, combined with the benefits of an oil economy, have meant that the state has high levels of productivity and dynamism. In addition to the historic prominence of energy in the state's economic profile, Texas has an exceptional track record in startup entrepreneurship, both in terms of the rate of new entrepreneurs and the number of jobs created by startups. This overall strong performance rewards Texas with 3rd place in the economic quality pillar, and has moved up 2 places since 2009. However, the dividends of this dynamic economy, which is mainly confined to the largest cities, are narrow and does not benefit all of the state's 29 million residents. The state reflects the Southwest's broader pattern of low incomes, poor health outcomes, and poor educational attainment. With high levels of poverty, overcrowded, and lack of affordable housing, it ranks 41st for the living conditions pillar. Residents also do not have universal access to preventative healthcare services, and consequently, it ranks 33rd on health. On education, the state has amongst the country's lowest scores at both grade 4 and grade 8, and the proportion of Texan adults with at least a high school diploma stands at 83%, the lowest in the country. This combined performance on education results in the state being ranked 41st. What can other states learn from the strength of Texas's economy? And what opportunities for Texas to learn from other states to improve the social well-being of its residents? For example, what could it learn from Utah's efforts that have resulted in 8th graders in that state now having the highest average science scores in the country? So in conclusion, we have pulled out today a few high insights to give you a taste of the powerful possibilities of the US Prosperity Index. But as Stephen has said, with over 200 interconnected indicators, 51 areas of interest, and 10 years' worth of data within the index, there is so much more that can be learned and applied. And our challenge to you is to investigate the index and find out more. The potential of the index is huge. Our ambition is that the index will help shape policies that will enable people to thrive and reach their full potential. Our call to action, if we may be so humble, is for leaders, policymakers, businesses and communities at all levels to use the index to identify the separate challenges that each state faces, to take and apply the approaches that have worked in other states, and implement data-driven, targeted policies that will deliver even greater prosperity for all. I'm going to hand over to Ryan now, who I think is going to lead us into a panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to welcome our panelists up to the stage, including our 2 most recent speakers. And I'll introduce those whom you've not been introduced to in a moment. But while they're taking their places, I'd like to draw your attention to the surveys that are in the middle of your tables. If you could, during the course of the discussion, fill those out and leave them behind. It will be great, useful feedback for our colleagues at the Legatum Institute to take back with them as they continue to analyze the rollout of the index. So I'm really pleased to have this distinguished panel with us today. And Stephen and Sean, you've just heard from and met, so I will not introduce them further, but I'll introduce the three faces you have not heard from yet. Closest to me is Carol Graham, who is the Leo Pazvolsky Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and College Park Professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Carol is the author of Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires, and Happiness for All, Unequal Lives and Hopes in the Pursuit of the American Dream, among many other publications. And Carol, I know, has been involved in advising on the index going back to the very earliest days. So Carol, it's good to see you again. Welcome back. On the other side of Stephen is John Lettieri, who's the president and co-founder of the Economic Innovation Group here in Washington, D.C., and he's also a visiting fellow here at AEI. John has spearheaded the development of several indices as well, which you'll probably be hearing about during his remarks, and was also the driver behind the design, creation, and implementation of opportunity zones in the tax bill, which many of you have probably heard about and know about and probably want to hear more about. And next to John is Keith Mueller, who is the Gerhard Hartman Professor and head of the Department of Health Management and Policy at the University of Iowa College of Public Health. He's also the director of the Rural Policy Research Institute Center for Rural Health Policy Analysis and chair of its Rural Health Panel. So you may gather he knows something about health in rural areas from his title. And we look forward to hearing from each of you. Before we open this up for a discussion, I'd like to ask Carol to take the first swipe at responding. And then from there, I'll pose some questions to the rest of our guests as we proceed. And I apologize because we have so many people with so much to say. I will be moderating this discussion from here. So if I look like the kind of the school marm peering over the shoulders of the students, I apologize. But this is where I have to be. So Carol, over to you.
Hopefully this launches my slide. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, having been involved, including with Ryan, in the initial days of the Legatum Prosperity Index. I was quite pleased to hear you were launching into a U.S. index. I think we need it here. And it really is an impressive job. I've had some discussions sort of from the early days and was thrilled and impressed to see how it turned out. And I think it's spot on in terms of how we have to think about U.S. prosperity. So there are big regional differences. There are pockets of terrible, not just poor health, terrible health. Deaths of despair, Sean mentioned, are a huge problem. We've seen a little downtick now. We're also seeing, unfortunately, little pockets of upticks with fentanyl deaths and now spreading to some urban areas. So the deaths of despair story is indeed something we have to cope with in a very major way, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. Obviously, pockets of very deep poverty. If you go to some of the low-ranked states, I spent most of my life working in the developing world, and the kind of poverty you see in the U.S. is actually much more depressing. And I think the deaths of despair, in part, reflect that. And then erosions in civic trust and institutions. And again, as was highlighted in both presentations, institutions are a key part of ensuring that economic prosperity translates into other kinds of prosperity. So the index makes a great contribution. And I think it's not just about comparing states and regions, but about how high levels of prosperity can coexist with very large challenges that much poorer countries do a better job of meeting. And I think these trends are quite remarkable in the context of one of the richest economies in the world. So more generally, I think the index shows why we need a range of metrics and lenses when we measure progress. I'm not one of these people that says, oh, we should throw out GDP or GNP. I think that's ridiculous. But we often find that other metrics tell us more, that there's more to the story than just GNP rankings and GNP trends. And it's not just the Legatum Prosperity Index, where the U.S. scores high on economy and rates low more generally. The World Happiness Indicator, not only are we quite low, but we've dropped 10 spots in the past decade. There's something going on in the U.S. that is quite worrisome. And so I think this index is a great tool. I don't think it's, you're being humble. I think this is going to be very relevant for policymakers. So let me try and add to the discussion, because I can't really add more than the index already has. And I would argue, though, that in the future, adding in subjective well-being metrics, as the global index has, might have something in addition to contribute. With these metrics, individuals essentially report how they're experiencing economic and social processes and their lives via evaluative questions such as life satisfaction and hope for the future, and daily experience questions such as stress or anger of the previous day, smiling or contentment. And I understand that this was a first launch of the index, and this is a whole other layer of complexity. But let me just spend the few minutes I've left to show you why I think these metrics are actually quite compelling for the US at the moment. We find that the gaps in scores between the poor and the rich in the US on things like hope for the future, belief in hard work, the classic American dream question, stress yesterday, worry yesterday, are much, much higher between the poor and the rich in the US than between the poor and the rich in Latin America. We're not talking about Germany, we're talking about Latin America. The poor in the US are 20 times less likely to say hard work will get them ahead than the poor in Latin America. I find that a stark marker. It's in my recent book, and that actually made me realize I was on the right track writing this book. So let me just talk a little bit about kind of what we know generally about subjective well-being and a bit about the US. So subjective well-being metrics often correspond with what GNP tells us, but not always. So these are the standard trends around the world. This holds for about 152 countries of the 162 countries that Gallup covers. And as you'll see, income matters. The story about money doesn't matter to happiness or whatever you want to call it. Income matters. Everywhere we study this, people who are destitute have much lower levels of life satisfaction than do people without it. But you also see that other things really matter too. Education, learning something yesterday. And that learning something yesterday question sort of proxies for having purpose and meaning in life. And we'll see the US scores very low among certain cohorts in that area. Health, huge issue. Again, US has very low ranking in health compared to very high ranking in economic prosperity. Freedom to choose what you want to do with your life. Well, if you're destitute, or if you grow up in a bad part of Louisiana or Texas with a really lousy education, you don't get a lot of freedom to choose what you want to do with your life, right? So, the other maybe two market things, or the most important thing is if you see being unemployed is really bad for well-being. Everywhere we study it, even worse than being unemployed, we find, is the mental state of prime-age males out of the labor force. So these are people who've just dropped out. So when we look at the US, we find we've got these booming stock markets. Everybody's boasting record low levels of unemployment. Yet we've got falling happiness, as I mentioned, rising premature deaths due to deaths of despair, and 20% roughly, depends on the age gap you use in terms of defining prime-age males, roughly 20% of prime-age males are out of the labor force. That's a huge number, and they're a toxic group. They're angry, they're desperate, they're worried, they're at home playing video games, they have no purpose or meaning in life, they're usually unattached, they're often in their parents' basements. But the numbers are tremendous. And when we talk about record low unemployment rates, people who haven't looked for a job in the past 6 months drop out of the ratio. So that's why it looks so good. You added these people back in, our unemployment rates would not look as good. So there's a big progress paradox in the US. So if we now look at the US, which according to, to the metrics we have, and one of the things that I think it was Stephen was saying, what we measure matters. When we initially started work on life satisfaction, well-being, people laughed at us, essentially. Now it's pretty mainstream in academic economics, and it was in Angus Deaton's Nobel speech, and he was on the Wellbeing Commission for Legatum, and the UK has subjective well-being metrics in its official stats. Many other countries do in their budgeting, all kinds of other processes. The US has been a bit laggard, but we had a National Academy of Sciences panel on well-being metrics in our statistics, and we managed to get them into some of the statistics. So this stuff is bubbling up. There are a lot of local experiments. The city of Santa Monica has a well-being index. There are other local level efforts. So we have a robust measurement science, and one of the things that we're finding is that our well-being metrics track with important trends. So, for example, this is probably, it's already been discussed, but this is the U.S. This is a classic deaths of despair slide. So this is a K-Steaton data. This is an all-cause mortality rate in the CDC for adults who are 45 to 54 in this particular slide. And as you look at all the other countries, they're mainly OECD countries, you'll see that mortality in this, for that age cohort, is going down, as you would expect in a prosperous country. Certainly one of the most prosperous countries in the world. If you look at that red line, that's US non-Hispanic whites. So those are the deaths of despair. And what we know is that they're concentrated in the group that used to have privileged access to the American dream. These are less than college educated whites. More males than females. Basically the slope is about the same for the deaths across males and females, but males started at a higher rate of suicide and overdose and everything else. If you look at the blue, the big dark blue line there, it says USH. That's US Hispanics. If you were to put US African Americans there, that would also be a downward trend, just like US Hispanics, that match the rich country trends. So it's this group that's very desperate. And one of the things that we did is we've matched our metrics of lack of hope, worry, anger, stress at the level of individual race and place, county level, state level. And we find indeed that the same places where you see a decline in manufacturing, where you see a lot of reported pain, where you see homogenous white communities that have hollowed out, are exactly the places and the people that correspond to the deaths of despair. We also looked back over time and found that had we been tracking well-being metrics in the same way that the UK does, other countries do, we would have seen that in the 70s, corresponding with the decline of manufacturing, optimism fell starkly for less than college-educated US males, at the same time that blacks and women increased their optimism because gender rights and civil rights were changing. So the drops in well-being preceded the deaths of despair by several decades. And we were all caught off guard by sort of 2015, and Angus released this mortality rate stuff. And at the same time, this is something I had found in my data and realized that we were telling a very similar story. So this is a kind of more optimistic part of the story, but this is optimism for the future, right? Where do you think your life satisfaction will be in 5 years? It's a very much a raw optimism question. This is compared to poor whites. Poor blacks, poor African Americans, traditionally disadvantaged group in the United States, are 3 times as likely to be higher up on an optimism scale. That when I found that, this really surprised me. This was the time of Ferguson and the Baltimore riots, and a lot of concern about the African American community being such a mess. Hispanics didn't surprise me. I'm from Peru. There's kind of a cheerfulness about Hispanics, but they're nowhere near as optimistic compared to poor whites as poor blacks. So again, this is a question. This is why sort of decomposing GNP in many different ways can tell you a very different story. As I mentioned before, African Americans and Hispanics are not in the deaths of despair. They still believe in education. Poor whites no longer believe in higher education in the United States. It's a pretty stark story. Again, just to support why these metrics tell us a lot about what's going on in the US. They uncover these progress paradoxes. And just maybe to give the US a break, one of the things is they exist in a lot of places, particularly where there's very unequal growth, very rapid growth that unsettles things. In China, during their high growth boom, which was 1995 to say 2005, they had record levels of growth, and yet suicides increased, mental health reports increased, life satisfaction dropped dramatically. This is the most recent story. You hear a lot about India's growth boom. So this is a period where growth was booming in India, 2006 to 2016, 17. And what we see is not only does life satisfaction drop 10 points, right, or 10%, basically, which is a very big drop because national average life satisfaction doesn't move very much. It's usually pretty stable, which is why the drops over 10 years in the US are also very large. But hope for the future life satisfaction also fell with the same slope, starting from a higher level. But so not only happiness, life satisfaction fell, but belief in the future, hope for the future has also fallen in India. So I think, again, it's an example of why we need different lenses and why sometimes we're surprised by unexpected unrest or unhappiness at a time of prosperity as defined by economic indicators. And I think the Legatum Index has done a great job of breaking down why all these different pieces make a difference. A last point, one of the things with any new metric, and I would argue that may matter also to the prosperity index, what the new measures you're introducing is, one thing is to measure things and get that right for subjective well-being. I think we've done that. But then the next thing is, how do you get these metrics into the public discourse in a way that people understand them? For example, this is not about replacing GNP with gross national happiness, but the average article tells you that's what it is. We know what we're trying to do is use the metrics to help in policy design, monitor policy progress, help with assessments, but that's not what the public knows. So part of it is just educating the public in terms of using the metrics. And if you think about it, this isn't new. The average person on the street, for example, if you tell them the unemployment rate went up by 10% last month, they'll go, oh my God, that's terrible. It went up by 0.1%, that doesn't matter. The same average Joe or Jane could not tell you how many people actually became unemployed in either scenario, because they don't, it's actually a pretty small number, but the public understands kind of a order of magnitude about these statistics. Same with the Dow Jones. The average person, if you say the Dow Jones fell by 500 points, oh, that's terrible. It fell by 20 points. So what? They probably couldn't explain beyond that what that really signifies in economic terms, but the metrics are in the public discourse. So I think in terms of this index, in terms of the kind of complementary metrics I'm speaking about, I think part of getting them to be effective at the level of policymakers, but also at the level of citizenship, because I think it's important that people in these different places that you've written about understand what's going on, is getting used to different metrics, and that just requires them being in the public discourse. So I've probably gone on too long.
Great. No, that's great, Carol. Thank you. And let me just follow up with one question for you. If over the last 20 years there'd been a steady rise in life satisfaction in the U.S., what types of social and other goods would we have experienced? Because we know from what you've presented that with declining levels of life satisfaction in certain segments of the population, we've seen things like the rise of deaths of despair, dropping out of the labor force. If the reverse were true, presumably those things would be impacted. What other kinds of things should we care about? If a hard-headed economist says, at the end of the day, if the economy is getting stronger and people's life satisfaction isn't changing, maybe there's just something wrong with people. But rising life satisfaction presumably has other types of effects and produces other types of goods that we should care about.
Right. Well, there probably is something wrong with people, but we're people, right? We've got to live with that, and we're not, sort of economic adonyms or something. But so one of the things that I think the Prosperity Index shows, that the subjective well-being literature also shows, is that all these other things that the report talks about, that the life satisfaction data talks about, is that things like institutions, civic trust, health is huge, social well-being matters a lot. There's one thing I think that we talk about less. We've just started to measure it robustly, and again, it's harder to talk about things where you have less robust data, and that is really purpose and meaning in life. And as we think about the future of work, and not just in the US, in other advanced economies, we think about AI, we think about the decline of manufacturing jobs, the rewards to high-skilled jobs, and not everybody can take part in that, and there are a lot of people who are left out. People lose their identity, their reason for being, right? And when you think about these prime-age males who've dropped out of the labor force, they score the lowest of any group on purpose, for example, right? So I think it's thinking about the other parts of prosperity, the other parts of human life that really matter to making prosperity work. I think things like meaningful engagement are really important. And if you think about a world where there probably will be less people fully employed, if that's what the AI and other scenarios suggest. And today's world, where a lot of prime age, low-skilled workers are not, they've fallen out of the labor force and they're not going to be reemployed anytime soon, we need to think a lot about how else can they engage. And there are wonderful lessons, including from a great effort in Britain, What Works Wellbeing, which I'm on the board of, where they do interventions in deprived communities and isolated communities. Simple things like increasing access to volunteering, increasing access to the art or green space. If you think about people who've lost their job or dropped out of the labor force, if they're sitting at home alone playing video games, which is what the time use surveys show happens in the US, that's pretty toxic. Mm-hmm. If you get people out, there are big well-being boosts. And then I think for the younger generations, there's a whole different story of how do you train younger people to be able to participate in, say, the low skill end of technology and other things. That's we have to retrain the younger generation, but there's a huge number of people, not just in the US, in the UK and Europe, whatever, who have lost their raison d'etre, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Stephen and Sean, and you can answer however you want. Is it possible to get the chart back up there? I was just curious if we can get the slide that has all the rankings from the index up there. I don't know if that, or do we need the
Let's see if we can do this.
Okay, all right.
That one?
There we go, that's fine.
Right.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, actually, I was going to mention Texas, so there you go. It was one of the states I was going to mention. So, California at 24th, Texas at 38th, Florida at 30th, New York in 12th place. Okay, 4 large U.S. states. So you have Texas and Florida ranking below California and New York. And yet, for the last 20 years, people have been leaving California, a lot of them for Texas. And so when people are voting with their feet here in the country, you've seen a pretty tremendous out-migration from people from California to places like Texas, to places like Florida, and the same is true of New York. So how do you explain that? Because in terms of preferences, people want to go to these places that nonetheless show up relatively low in your rankings. And I'd just like you to address that, since I'm sure it's probably on the minds of others too.
Let me have a first crack at it, and then Sean might want to weigh in with some of the details. One of the things that's going on here is you've mentioned 4 big states, and these are not 4 homogeneous states. So while you're looking at sort of a macro migration trend from one state to another, I think to really understand what's happening, you need to at least add in as a rural to urban dimension, and probably even down at a more sort of census tract to census tract movement. So what's really going on? And I think when you then play that back into some of Enrico Moretti's work, looking at migration patterns and looking at housing and zoning restrictions, there may well be a desire within, say, California to move to San Francisco from the Central Valley. But if there's actually if there's no expansion of the housing stock, your rural to urban transition within California is closed. And if you want to do a rural to urban transition, the next best option may well be to go to Texas. And that, as cities like San Antonio, Austin expand, they can absorb that. So I think a simple state-to-state analysis is not enough. And that's one of the reasons why next year we're going to be taking this index, and Sean can talk a bit about the detail, to a county-by-county level in selected states to try and unpick this, because San Antonio versus rural Texas, Central Valley versus LA or San Francisco, these are very different stories. And I think if we sort of take some of Carol's narrative and ask the questions in those 2 different places, we'd probably find very different answers. So I'd say get to the county level, and I think we'll see a different picture.
Yeah. Okay. John, I'd like to bring you into the conversation because you've built some indices over the last few years, and you have an index on state dynamism, which looks at a different number of indicators and comes up when and I'm going to say something about rankings, but before I say that, I want to say that we can place a little bit too much confidence in rankings when we're looking in sort of a macro scale that can be unhelpful. But it is interesting, by way of contrast, to bring this up, that in your index, which I'd like you to explain what it's actually measuring, Connecticut's number 42, where it's number 2 in the U.S. Prosperity Index. And you can find a few other of those too. Nevada, at the top of your list, is number 44 in this particular index. And so you're measuring dynamism, which is something in particular which looks a lot different than this definition of prosperity. I think there are probably some strong relations between these two concepts, and yet we have these kind of widely divergent outcomes. And so I wonder if you have some thoughts on why that is, based on what you guys have done with the index.
Well, first, I want to congratulate the Legatum team for what they've done. It's a remarkable product and achievement, and one that makes me a little bit jealous. As somebody who's been through this process before, I'm already picking up clues for our next project. So I think with our dynamism index at the state level, we have 2 primary index products that we've created. One is an ongoing effort called the Distressed Communities Index, which is in many ways more analogous to this exercise. The other is an index of state dynamism. And what we mean by dynamism is the magnitude and direction of changefulness in a state economy. So we're looking in particular at business formation rates and closure rates. We're looking at the workforce participation, how much are you putting human capital to work in a productive economy. We're looking at the proportion of workers who work at a young company versus an older incumbent company. So factors like this that give us a sense of how new and fresh and changeful is an economy versus how old and static is a statewide economy, both labor force and business environment. So I think it's measuring a different thing that kind of nests within some of what I see here in their index, which is why you'll see some divergent findings. You can have a Nevada or a Utah or Colorado, which rank at the very top of our index. And overall, I should say, the U.S. economy as a whole is becoming relatively less dynamic over time, and particularly in the wake of the Great Recession, has really those indicators of dynamism have collapsed and have not rebounded. So that's a primary concern of mine and my organizations. But you can have an economy that, if you look at it in a snapshot, is not itself relatively prosperous compared to the rest of the country, but is dynamic and growing, and therefore in catch-up mode. So I'd say when we crosswalk our findings on prosperity and dynamism, we find really strong overlaps in states like Utah that rank very close to the top on both of those measures. I will say one of the things that is challenging, the U.S. economy is so big that it can hide a lot of secrets. And so what I think is really useful about indices is it allows us some lenses through which to peer underneath the hood, so to speak, of the economy and try to understand where there may be things that we can't see in the aggregate that we can see much better underneath that surface. And for us, getting down to the zip code and the county level on a more narrowly scoped economic well-being index has helped us see how divergent the U.S. economy, when you look at community well-being, has really become. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. So I note that with the Prosperity Index, you see a convergence among states. We see a divergence among neighborhoods, zip codes, when it comes to the top most prosperous and the most distressed at the bottom, and one that's a chasm that's growing. And this is a really post-Great Recession phenomenon that we've not experienced before, where as the national economy has grown, traditionally we expect most places, when you get down to a more granular level, certainly at the county level, to match the national levels of growth. The first time that's really not true is the post-Great Recession economy, at least that we have kind of standardized records for. And so that presents an entirely new type of policymaking challenge when, if you can't just rely on the aggregates to tell you most of the story, you've got to dig deeper, and I think tools like this are really helpful.
Yeah, great. Since you referenced this and this has come up a bit, I want to ask Keith about this urban-rural divide or metro-rural divide, which I know you know quite a bit about. And I know your expertise is in health outcomes, but you've studied a lot of other issues as well related to this divide. And I wonder if you can just, before talking about health in particular, just reflect a little bit on whether or not this divide is sort of a permanent thing. This in Texas being a great example of where its growth, population-wise, what we measure economically is really driven by four major metro areas, and the rest of the state has been stagnant or declining by most measures that we say that we care about. It seems like this is a trend that's been gathering steam for a while and that shows no signs of abating. Is that the case, and how should we think about that?
Well, much like a lot of the other comments about what the U.S. economy is so large and what it might disguise that we could learn from, The same is true if you try to characterize all of rural, which in your comment in a lot of our definitions, we talk about metropolitan and then non-metropolitan, which includes micropolitan areas, which are more regional in nature and regional sub-state regional economies, and some of them are going through some of the same growth that John is talking about. I tend to view it as there's as much potential in both places, in maybe what we haven't done that I think we're doing more now, and indices like this, and I too want to applaud Legatum, are very helpful to us, is shine a lens on some of the places. So shine a lens on rural Texas. And when we do that, find even in rural Texas, where are there some communities and places that are learning how to bring together what their assets are in the community to move it forward, to take advantage of policy levers that exist. And that's what I know more about in the healthcare arena, and they keep growing, of what you could do differently with either direct investment capital or what you could do differently with payment systems in the case of healthcare. So I don't view it as a situation in which that divide should just be accepted and it's going to continue, and if anything, widen. I tend to see it instead of there are opportunities to learn how to, and I don't even like measuring, trying to narrow the divide, but to improve what's happening in the smaller rural communities at much the same pace at what happens in the larger metropolitan.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, Sean, if you were to come over to the States and be made honorary governors of a state, you can pick whichever one you want. I'd recommend something small. It's more manageable. And you wanted to really focus on a couple of the pillars. And I know that obviously the answer is going to depend on the state in which you're residing and which you're governor. But which pillars are the most important? I'm asking this because, Stephen, at the beginning of your remarks, you talked about how institutions seem to matter, that a lot of what we measure in terms of economic terms can also be explained or predicted to some degree by other types of things that are institutional in nature. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what that would mean for a governor who wants to focus specifically on select pillars here?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think if I were a governor and sort of felt I had a long time horizon, I think that would be quite important. I'd have to sort of be thinking in terms of multiple terms, because change.
You have to get rid of the accent.
So, if I could hide my accent,
We've probably had Irish accents as governors if you go back far enough, I think.
Yeah, I would differentiate a short-term program from a long-term program, and the long-term program definitely would be the institutional piece. And I'd be saying, what is it about the way in which these different institutions, allow people to participate in the economy, to participate in society? So, when we think about safety and security, the extent to which crime-ridden areas detract from the investment pool that's available, the extent to which they create alternative pathways for young teenagers. So that's sort of issue number one. The sort of the criminal justice system, I think, is one that we're seeing around the country a lot of reform, because I think a lot of people are now recognizing that that system has been broken. And that sort of, at one level, when we look at this at global level, safety and security is issue number one. If you do not have a safe and secure environment, not much else is going to be able to flourish. And I think that operates equally at a sort of micro community level. So that's where I would start. I think then the next piece that I see as happening is the areas around discrimination and social tolerance. So if you say, okay, basically the place is safe, we do not have pathways of crime to people as they grow up, are we then providing the positive pathways where people can feel they can engage, they get opportunities, there are often the barriers? Carol, you were talking about how maybe over the last sort of 20, 30, 40 years, one group had been privileged, but they were privileged because others had been discriminated against, both legally and socially. And as those discriminations have gone, we see greater levels of ethnic minorities rising through the ranks of companies, a massive shift over the last 30, 40 years of women's participation in the labour market. These are very big positive things. They've had the negative downside that we're seeing, but there are at a micro level still lots of barriers for people. And that's the next part of the institutions, both formal and informal discrimination and tolerance issues, I think, are the next thing that hold people back. I think once those two are done, I expect that the third level I would be thinking about in this space will be around the social capital, and the extent to which, if we've removed the barriers, we still need the nurturing, we still need the support. People need to be able to lean back on their friends and family in times of trouble. So again, the comment that you've made around the prime age males, they're mostly single. They don't have the network. And I'd say one thing that we've noticed, Philippa and I have been doing quite a bit of work on poverty in the UK. And one thing we looked at recently was poverty rates by age. And for couples, poverty rate drops as people get older. Basically, people are accumulating wealth, people are increasing their average levels of income. So a sort of, the sort of stereotypical, sort of well-structured family setup is less and less likely to be in poverty as the family matures. On the other hand, the poverty rates for singles goes up over time. And what we're seeing is actually that that group, as a whole, the group that have not developed the family formation, have not got the hinterland to fall back on, are more and more at risk of poverty as they get older. So that's where I think that's the next level, is making sure that people have that support around them, so that they have the sort of the positive support of social capital to push them through the barriers that used to be there.
Can I
please,
say
please.
where I would... Well, I was a bit disappointed, actually, because I was looking down the ranking table, because the immediate thing that came to my mind was Hawaii. But I think personally I'd start with the economy. So I would start with a state that has a strong economy but is not filtering through into the other aspects of prosperity, which rules out Hawaii, unfortunately. So perhaps Delaware, which seems to have a strong, thriving economy, but it's not being fully translated. So there are aspects of its inclusive society domain where it's not functioning properly. So around personal freedom, it would be to really understand what's driving that high level of personal freedom. Its governance is reasonable, its safety and security is also reasonable, but its health outcomes overall are quite poor at 35th. So I would use this to go into Delaware. It's clearly got the finances, it's got the money to be able to address some of the challenges, but it's not filtering through, and then start there.
Okay, very good. And the personal freedom thing I do want to come back to in a second. But before I do that, I wanted to ask a little bit just about the relationship between health and well-being. Both Keith and Carol have talked about health and its important role in all of this. And obviously, this is a huge issue for us as a country as we continue to debate healthcare at every election interminably. This is a big topic for all kinds of big and important reasons. Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between healthcare and health outcomes and well-being? And is there a difference, Keith, in the urban-rural divide on that particular issue?
Yes, there is a difference. The CDC had a series in its monthly morbidity mortality reports that's a little over a year old now that indicated a widening gap on some of the mortality measures, life expectancy measures, as well as some of the morbidity measures in chronic conditions between metropolitan and non-metropolitan. We don't fully understand why that's happening. That's something that we need to look at. So that kind of gap exists. The health and well-being, I'm really intrigued by that, because a lot of what we're focused on in the work that we do at Rupri is looking at everything in a community and trying to think about sustainable, livable environments in communities. Healthcare is a critical piece of that, but it's tightly interrelated with some of the other indicators, the economic indicators, social capital, education. And if you try to think of it in terms of causality, the arrows go both ways, of course, that the healthier you are, the more likely and you're able to take advantage of whatever might occur in social and education. Conversely, we need to pay a lot of attention to, in our jargon in public health, we would call the social determinants of health. And where that takes us, and what intrigues me is, we can use some of these measures and indices to think through, are we making that broader difference in well-being when we're shifting public policy like payment for healthcare services out of payment just for sick care, or when you go in to payment to healthcare organizations to address the total health and well-being of the population they serve immediately in their communities. And we will need these kinds of measures to understand, are we making a difference with some of those policy shifts?
Thank you. Carol?
I just wanted to jump in on that. I agree with everything you said, but there's also kind of an additional story. Some of it has to do with selection bias. A lot of it has to do with health behaviors. But so when you see the same places that are hollowed out economically, hollowed out in terms of social capital, you see much worse health behaviors, more smoking, less exercising, terrible indicators on diabetes, overweight, everything else. And part of it is just the starting differences in rural, urban healthcare, health knowledge, norms of health. What is good health? We see at the same time the places, urban areas that have much better objective health outcomes, better health behaviors. People are more critical as they assess their own health because they expect better health, right? So there's almost a demand side of the story that comes with the social determinants of health. And there's also selection bias because comparing urban and rural places, but places where people have stayed versus places where people have moved for mobility reasons, we see this trend sort of exacerbated, right? So the same people that sought out economic opportunity and left the declining rural places have gone to places where there are better health standards. They then get better expectations, they have better health practices, and they demand better health. And so in the other places, you get poor norms of health, not good demand for health. And another part of the story is that in these same hollowed out places, you're getting this closure of rural hospitals. So people have to go 2 hours to get to a hospital in a lot of rural areas, poor rural areas. And so it's sort of a vicious cycle.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, John, about the opportunity zones. I mentioned that earlier when I was introducing you. And for those of you who are familiar with the zones, they wouldn't be possible without the Distressed Communities Index that EIG has created. As those are being implemented now, what role is institutional health and well-being and social capital and these other types of things kind of in the middle columns playing right now as you see those being implemented? How important are they? I'm just curious, as I'm thinking about your index and this one, it seems like there's stuff in here that's relevant to what you guys are doing.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a tough one because it's sometimes difficult to measure the state and impact of institutions in local economies and in the implementation of a policy like this. But anecdotally, what we see is all of the places that are early winners or making early progress in the implementation of this policy, meaning places that fit the traditional characteristics of a distressed city, a declining community, a struggling, disinvested place. There's a subset of those that have really strong civic engagement and civic and social capital within their communities that have already gotten to the place pre-policy that we've hit bottom, we need to try something different, and we need to really make more of the assets we have in this community. Those are the ones that are seeing early progress. So places that many of us, kind of the coastal elites in this room, would have given up a long time ago on, they have doubled down on really binding together and making their institutions more accountable to local outcomes. And what's remarkable to me is how many of these communities you see in very close proximity to thriving institutions who have never really been connected or accountable to those local outcomes. And I'll give you an example of a Notre Dame and South Bend, Johns Hopkins and Baltimore. You have, not to say that they've never been engaged, but the kind of connectivity that you'd expect to see from a world-class anchor institution and generational poverty and decline that's happening right in the backyard of those world-class institutions, the lack of ability to leverage to date some of those advantages has really held back the potential of a lot of these communities. So what opportunity zones we see doing is really catalyzing a different type of conversation among these different stakeholders to think about that question of what is the institutional role across these different sectors for this broader goal that we have. And being purposeful about that is so important. Communities that have a sense of where they want to go, especially in these transitional regions like the Midwest and the Northeast, are doing much better than places that are just struggling to catch back up with where they once were. And it's again, hard to measure, but you get a very strong anecdotal sense of it when you talk to folks on the ground and leaders in these communities, the ones that have a game plan and are thinking aspirationally looking forward versus the ones that are still complaining about, well, we used to have that GM plant and it closed 20 years ago and we haven't recovered since. There's something very different in the water in these different types of communities. And the institutions are playing a very important role in really binding that all together.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thanks. I'm going to leave a few minutes here for questions, and we will have a microphone that can rove to you if you have a question. So be thinking about that. And before I do, I said I was going to come back to personal freedom, and I wanted to ask, maybe Sean, you're the person to ask sort of what went into the measure of personal freedom. Stephen went over that briefly. I'm looking at the rankings here, and it's just interesting that you have like Minnesota and Wisconsin are 25th and 26th, right in the middle. I don't know if there's something about Lutheranism that sort of like, has this backwards pull on freedom, or Nebraska and Wyoming also in the mid-20s, this kind of the western, the frontier, which attracted frontier peoples. And the people that rank, the states that rank high are, states like Connecticut, Utah out in the west, but New Jersey, here in D.C., often we think of northeastern states as having kind of more restrictive regulatory environments and much more relaxed ones, say, in places like Wyoming and Nebraska, but that must not be what we're measuring here. I ask that because in our survey work here at AEI, when we ask Americans about their preferred definition of the American dream, and we give them a choice of about 9 definitions: having a better life than your parents, owning a home, having a successful career, the number one thing across all demographic groups that people say is essential to the American dream is being free to live my life as I choose. So personal freedom is a core value here in America.
I just want to say I refuse to believe that New Jersey is number 7 on personal freedom, given that you can't pump gas in this state without permission. So that was my one critique of the.
I know when you don't know that and you get out of your car and you get shouted at to get back in your car. I know it feels very restrictive. So personal freedom. What goes into that?
Sure. Well, page 70 on the report clearly identifies what goes into it. And I think, Ryan, you raise a very good point. I think when you ask people about freedom, I think how people visualize that and respond to that and internalize that is probably quite different. I think people have a different perspective of what freedom is to them. So what we've tried to do through the index is be very clear about what we mean by freedom. And so, looking at the different elements here, we look around freedom of association and speech, that ability to be able to express yourself, free to gather in places to express your view. The other element is around agency. So it's that sort of sense that people are free from coercion or forced to do or not do, free or not to join a union as well. And then absence of legal discrimination. So are there sort of legal discriminations in place to stop certain groups in society being discriminated against? And then finally, what we've tried to do in the social tolerance is really that sort of sense of what's the experience of people living in society? Do they actually feel free in where they live? And what we found there, because one of the key things around sort of experience is around racial discrimination, and we found it quite interesting that, maybe you could advise us afterwards, but we struggled really to find any really good metrics at state level that assess the level of racial discrimination. So we decided to create our own. So you'll see in here the use of ethnic slurs, which is a Google trend search where we identified specific sort of terms against certain groups which are too offensive even to mention. And we looked at how many times that had been searched for to gain a sort of rate across each of the states. And it was really interesting that actually it followed quite a similar pattern to those who were sort of opposing or where the states had highest opposition to same-sex marriage. There was quite a high degree of overlap between those two states. So that just paints a bit of a picture, but more detail is available in these pages as to exactly what we mean by personal freedom. Now we can debate that and we can discuss that and we should do that, But we've been very clear on what's in and what's not.
But I think to John's point, the other elements of freedom, if you think about how the freedom of the 50 states works, there's sort of an economic freedom and a personal freedom. So Sean has outlined the personal freedom. The economic freedoms, the level of occupational licensing, can you pump your own gas, will be coming under the business environment. So we're not ignoring them.
I was just giving you a hard time.
But we're seeing that's where we see them.
All right, very good. Let's take a couple of questions here, if there are a couple. And I have two rules. Make your questions concise and make your questions in the form of a question. I think we have one hand up back here.
Hi, my name is Juliana Cardona, and I'm the founder of Street Entrepreneurs. We care about economic mobility, and we use entrepreneurship as a vehicle for it. I'm really interested in rural areas, and I would love to hear from all of you what are some data points you wish were a bit more robust to kind of determine what are kind of the biggest opportunities we can take to increase economic mobility in rural areas. And Carol, I love your work.
Oh, thank you very much.
Sorry.
All right, very good. Rural areas. Did we have another hand up back here? No, okay, let's go. I was going to take two questions. Oh, we do. Yeah, let's take a second question too, since we are a little short on time, and then the panelists can respond to both of them in turn.
Given the accent, I hesitate almost to speak, lest Legatum be accused of importing the audience as well as the speakers. But having lived, despite the accent, in Connecticut, I do just want to reinforce the point which has come forward at several stages here, which is the sense of prosperity not being reflected across a given state equally, because I'm very conscious of Connecticut having Greenwich at one end and Bridgeport at the other. And the sense of that inequality is really quite deep and quite troubling. And therefore, to my mind, compromises the sense of Connecticut coming too out of your list. I find that quite intriguing. But secondly, I wanted to ask if we might probe the educational dynamic. There was a rather interesting thread emerging of a loss of confidence in what one might call the social compact, which we've always presumed upon, which was education leads to future prosperity, and that's a very simple equation. There's clearly part of the population which is not invested, no longer feels that to be the case, and that seems to me to have potentially very dramatic impact ahead for education. It's had a 40, 50-year run of unchecked growth, certainly economically and so on. I would just wonder what the impact of that will be if that compact breaks down.
All right, very good. So indicators on rural areas and the breakdown of the social compact.
Well, in rural areas, two comments. One, this is a great start with the index and things we can do comparing across states. I'm really looking forward to the next year and getting to a sub-state level so we can understand how these indices play out in rural, and then within rural, if we can get to a county level, we do have ways of classifying counties in different clusters based on size and distance from a metropolitan area or a micropolitan area. Measures I'd love to see even more would be economic opportunity over time and how that changes. So if we look at upward mobility across time within areas, that would be one that I would look for. In the health arena, I'd look to see the viability of local health delivery systems. You mentioned hospital closures. I would focus somewhere in the realm of primary services and see if that makes a difference.
Would anyone like? Yeah, go ahead.
Education and the social. So I know a bit, and I'm trying to understand more. So what we know that's quite surprising is that and I've spoken to heads of historically black colleges and a whole range of other people, is that minorities still seem to believe in education paying off in a robust way, and even among poor minorities. They don't always have the access to get to higher levels, but there is a strong belief in it. Versus it's broken down not for rich, educated whites and their children who have privileged access to it, but it's broken down in exactly the same groups where you used to have a high school education and you ended up with a respected job, a respected middle-class life, a stable family, and that was it. And that was kind of all you ever looked for. And there wasn't sort of you need to go to college to get ahead because you finished high school and you kind of worked in the job that your dad had at this point. It was kind of a male story. And that has indeed broken down, and it's been, I would say, exacerbated by breakdown in civic trust, political divisions, this sort of skepticism of coastal elites, and just kind of a political and social divide that we don't completely have our heads around, except that we know it's bad. What I'm trying to understand a little bit better is to explore these differences a bit. I'm originally from Peru, and I do a lot of survey work there, but one of the things, it's also a place where there's a strong belief in education, and I have these surveys of poor adolescents who have incredibly high education aspirations despite lots of negative shocks. Not one of the parents in my survey, it's a poor peri-urban area, has college education. They all want their kids to. The kids aspire, 85% of these poor urban kids aspire they aspire to either college or post-college education. You try that in poor rural Missouri, and you might get 1%.
Where are they getting that aspiration if none of their parents have gone to college?
Because their parents believe it. In the same way that that's a trend that if you think about African American and minority parents here, parents who haven't gone to education want their kids to go to college. That's not the case for poor whites. I can't fully explain it. What I'm going to try and do, I'm in the process of getting it set up, is to do the same survey in poor African American, Missouri, St. Louis, and poor white former coal mining counties across the river, and get a sense of how adolescent aspirations of education and their future and all kinds of other things diverge or not. My initial cut shows that already respondents in poor urban St. Louis, destitute African American, are much more optimistic in general than the poor whites across the river. So it's a puzzle. I don't think we fully know, but there is this huge skepticism of higher education among the exact same groups that need to get it, or their kids need to get it if they're not going to stay in deprived places.
Friends and colleagues, we try to keep things on track and on time here at AEI, so I'm going to have to draw this to a close before everyone's had an opportunity to ask their questions. However, we do have a way of prolonging the opportunity to engage with our panelists because we have wine and cheese on the other side of those doors, and so you're welcome to help yourself and ask a few questions if you didn't have a chance to get those in. But before we do that, please join me in thanking our friends and colleagues from the Legatum Institute and our distinguished panelists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.